이번 주에 한참 8년 만에 콜드플레이가 내한을 하면서 어떤 분들은 콜드플레이 콘서트에 가서 떼창을 하기 위해서 미리 가사를 예습하고 있다. 진짜 의지의 코리안들. 콜드플레이 내한이 결정됐을 때쯤 해서 저한테 굉장히 흥미로운 인터뷰 제안이 왔어요. 전에 우리 컨텐츠에 라이브에서 기타 연주를 해줬던 제 친한 친구 드니 승호가 얼마 전에 존 메트칼프라고 하는 영국의 작곡가와 같이 프로젝트를 하게 됐다고 합니다. 이 존 메트칼프라는 분이 콜드플레이 노래 편곡하신 분이라고 하더라고요. 그래서 혹시 이제 내년에 콜드플레이가 오는데 존 메트칼프와 함께 어떻게 콜드플레이와 일하게 됐는지, 그분의 음악 철학은 무엇인지 이런 얘기를 나눠보는 컨텐츠를 만들 생각이 있냐라고 해서 of course 라고 얘기를 했고, 존 메트칼프와 1시간 남짓 클래식 음악과 크로스오버란 무엇인가, 콜드플레이와 일한 경험은 어땠나, 이런 대화를 나눴습니다. 저는 존 메트칼프와 대화를 하면서 그냥 마음이 따뜻해졌어요. 열린 마음을 가지고 예술에 대해서 굉장한 긍정적인 마인드와 행복감을 가지고 접근을 하시는 분이어서 그냥 얘기만 같이 해도 기분이 좋아진다라는 생각을 했고요. 관중을 생각하면서도 자신의 예술 세계를 잃지 않는 예술가의 모습이라는 게 이런 거구나 라고 저한테 많은 귀감을 준 대화였습니다. 이거를 이제 작년 11월부터 그동안 묵혀왔다가 한창 콜드플레이가 화제인 오늘 여러분께 소개를 하게 됐고요. 제가 메트칼프와 대화를 하면서 느꼈던 예술적 완숙함과 그 인격적인 따뜻함이 이 대화를 통해서 여러분께 전해지기를 바랍니다.
People who are not really into music, they'll be asking themselves, who is this person that's on Seungyeon's YouTube channel? And then they're going to look you up. And the first information they're going to find if they use a Korean search engine is that you've made arrangements for Blur and Coldplay and these famous rock artists that Korean people are familiar with. So a lot of people who are classical musicians or composers that I know, they usually either work in one genre or they work with group of people they've known. Did you listen to like a specific music that somebody does and say, oh, I could do an excellent arrangement with their musical style? Is that a decision you made or did they seek you out?
The short answer is they rang me. I think they came to me through my work. I'm not quite sure who said what to who and who whispered in whose ear, like, you should better get this guy. But I think part of it came because they knew my work with Peter Gabriel, with the kind of, I'd done 2 orchestral records with Peter 2 or 3 years before. And I think that just kind of like popped up on their radar, I guess. I've never actually sort of spoken to Chris or any of the band or their management about how that came about. But I think they sort of liked what they heard. And I think that Coldplay are one of these bands, you know, like Radiohead, that stay curious, stay adventurous, want to try things, want to work with different people. And I think they just thought, well, you know, I guess we've got nothing to lose. We don't have to, if he's rubbish, we don't have to put it out. But they, you know, fortunately they liked it, you know, and I've had a good, beautiful relationship with them over the last, 10 years now.
Oh.
Yeah, but I think I've been relatively fortunate in that my kind of trail through working with these artists, I've done certain projects where I'm battling to make my voice heard. But I think, and you're sort of saying, hey, I'm over here. But I think with the work with these well-known bands has always just, I've been very fortunate. It's always just come to me. I mean, the work with Blur started because I was in a group called the Girotti Column, which was on the old Factory label in Manchester. And the producer of 2 of our records was Stephen Street, who produced The Smiths, rang me up and said, I'm working on Morrissey's first solo album after he and the Smiths after the Smiths had split up. We need some string arrangements. Would you do some string arrangements? And I said, yes, absolutely. Even though I harmonized a couple of Bach chorales at college, as you know, and I said, yeah, great. You know, I thought, well, I was a big Smiths fan. I thought, I'm not going to say no. So I chanced my arm, and then, you know, so I developed a good relationship with Stephen Street. So it kind of went from there.
So while preparing for this interview, I listened to some of the popular music that you collaborated on, and I listened to some of your string quartet work and some of the classical work you do. And then I almost felt like your musical DNA sort of split, and this part of like Helix attached itself to a completely different half of Helix, and you know it developed into this wonderful new organism. Like I used to listen to a lot of classical music. It was sort of the main thing I used to listen to when I was in college. There was my rebellion against other people my age because they were all
Yeah.
listening to rock and all this stuff. I'm like, I want to be different. I'm just going to listen to old music.
Brilliant.
And so I'm like, I'm not going to listen to anything after like, Schubert, because it's too newfangled for me. And that became sort of my youthful rebellion. And then when I listened to the way your work was incorporated into some of the most popular musics in the world, I really felt, okay, classical music doesn't have to look or sound like the music that I knew and loved back when I was 24 and I was listening to this music that was written 150 years ago. Like, strands of this DNA can detach itself, attach to other musical forms, and it becomes this wonderful new thing. And you gave me that realization. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, I'm absolutely delighted. Oh, that's so cool. I'm so happy to hear that. It's brilliant. And for me, there are certain composers that perhaps made me realize that in a particular way as well. I grew up with particularly those two strands of music, with rock and pop music. I loved that. In a way, that was my first love. I started playing the viola when I was 10, and I didn't do any practice, and I sort of hated practicing, and I kind of thought it was boring. But I think, and I sort of came to personally, even though I trained in classical music, my love of it blossomed when probably not until I was really sort of 20, 21. I loved playing the pieces that I was playing, but I didn't immerse myself in classical culture. I didn't go to the opera. I didn't go to classical concerts all the time. I went to gigs. I went out clubbing. So, for me, I've never had any problem with using all of my influences. But when I'm writing in a more classical sound world, like if it's a string only piece, people are going to hear that and going to say, well, that's classical, even though it's mainly kind of craft work or dance music or drum and bass. Even if there's no beats there's part of that sensibility, that energy, that drive, those speeds that I use that's there all the time in everything I do. And the fact that it also therefore feeds into the pop artists or the rock artists that I do work with. It's brilliant. I'm not kind of like thinking, oh, I'm in the classical tradition now, so that's how I have to write. I have to do this and I have to use these things, or I'm in a pop thing. Yeah, I mean, I can't write sort of a great big cloud of intricate collegno or special string techniques when the singer is singing the second verse, because they're just going to say, what are you doing? This is a song. The audience need to hear the lyrics, need to hear the thing. So you obviously apply those principles.
So the weirdest thing that's going on right now is that I'm actually speaking to a living, breathing classical composer. Because when we think about a classical composer, one characteristic of a classical composer that we imagine is that he or she is dead, right? So if you ask a primary school kid, like, draw me a classical composer, without specifying whom, the elementary school child will usually draw somebody in a 19th century frock coat, wearing a gilet, maybe a bow tie, staring angrily into the camera, or whoever was, painting the portrait, like he has all the discontentment of the world on his back. And that's the image of a classical composer that we have in our head. And then
Yes.
You don't seem to fit that profile at all. First of all, we are in 2024 and you are alive and you collaborate a lot with contemporary artists who are not in classical music. So first of all, what is that like being a classical composer in 2024?
I mean, of course, historically, a lot of composers use their music to pour their hearts, their soul, their despair, their description of the human condition into their music. Of course, we think of people like Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert, who are very famous, but of course, Beethoven he seems to look a bit angry. But I think there's also, lots of composers are actually also quite happy people and have relatively happy, successful, fulfilled lives. Well, I mean, the first thing to say also is that I never view myself strictly as a purely classical composer. I mean, of course, I work in that medium. I work in that sound world. My training is as a classical viola player. I originally trained as a performer and not so much as a composer. And I came to writing and composing music later on in my life and my career. So I have to admit, I never had any real formal training as a composer. So my style, my musical voice, if you like, with the pieces that I write I've arrived at them through a series of meetings with people, my relationships with people, my relationship with how I want to express myself. I don't go to many cocktail parties, but if I do, and people say, what do you do? I think in a way they probably think that I'm cleverer than I am. I'm not that smart.
Oh, that's what smart people always say.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, no, it's true in my case. I'm the exception that proves the rule. And I think that, where the discussion leads, if it is sort of based around music, it's about connection. It's about relationships. I don't, it's not like they'll say, oh, that's very interesting. Tell me about how you view sonata form or a binary or a rondo and how that affects your writing. We're always into connection with people and performance and emotions and those kind of things. So I think to say that you're a classical composer, particularly now, isn't that frightening for people. I would say the last sort of 50 years, really, particularly the last 50 years, is that our understanding of what being a composer is and the music that those more modern composers write has really changed. And I think it's not inaccessible anymore. I think the composers who have grown up, it's a generational thing as well. I think some composers are sort of like, yeah, perhaps just in their own head. But I think a lot of modern composers really do a lot of different things as well. They're not just writing string quartets or symphonies or choral pieces. They're writing for TV, they're writing for film, they're writing for games. When I was a lot younger, I loved clubbing. I mean, I'm old enough to have been to the Hacienda a lot in Manchester, a very famous nightclub here in the UK. And that informed a lot of my writing style. I love dance music. I love club music. I love electronic music. So I grew up with Kraftwerk and things like that. So, of course, those kind of influences really bear very heavily on the kind of work that not just me, but other more contemporary, shall we say, composers think and how they want to express themselves and reach their audience. So, yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're different, but we're hopefully different in good ways, not in a kind of comparative and critical way necessarily.
A lot of people outside of Europe tend to put certain European culture on a pedestal.
Right.
I think there are, outside of Europe, two different ways of engaging with classical music. So the general public usually find it very snobbish, and they're like, I don't want to go to an opera because I have to sit there for 3 hours in a suit, and that's not for me. And there's other part, especially in East Asia, where understanding Western classical music becomes like a big status symbol, right? Because you have to master a foreign language, and you have to travel to certain European cities to go to the opera houses with 100, 200-year tradition. So when you're in a cocktail conversation, somebody just asking you like, what's your favorite symphony or what's your favorite concerto, becomes like, oh, I'm in this class that can enjoy this culture, right? If you had to tell people this is the way to enjoy it, the way to embrace classical music more closer to real life, like how would you advise somebody who has either one of these conceptions of music?
For classical music to survive, there are all sorts of things at play here. I would say primarily it is, for me, in terms of what I want to try and to persuade a bigger audience to come to classical music, is to respond at an emotional level. And very interestingly, I played in classical string quartet for a very, very long time. We toured and we recorded, but we also did a lot of concerts in prisons, in hospitals, and particularly in schools. What was fascinating is that we quite often would play quite difficult contemporary, then 20th century repertoire that perhaps a more kind of adult audience that hadn't had very much exposure to classical music might find very complicated. We would say to young children, we're going to play you a piece, and it would be Shostakovich or Bartok and something like that. And we would say, want to close your eyes. And at the end, we're going to ask you what it made you think of, what it made you feel. And some of the answers that we would get would be amazing, and people would think of like, wild animals running everywhere, or places being on fire, or they'd be floating out in space. They were just all sorts of amazing responses. For me, that's the very core of it. I've spent my life actually trying to break down the barriers that have been put up, because yes, you're right. I think with a lot of music, not just classical, but I think I've experienced this sometimes in electronic music. There is a kind of like this is for us. People want to own it. They want to protect it. They want to feel like nobody else should be listening to it particularly, that they're somehow special because only they know about this kind of music. And I think that has particularly been the case with classical music, certainly in the past. And maybe it continues a little bit now, less so. I started up a label on the on the Factory label in Manchester to try and get quite difficult contemporary music, classical music, out to a kind of a rock audience, but an adventurous rock audience, and say, look, it doesn't matter what the name of the person who's written the music is. If you like it or you get a response, whether actually you hate it, I mean, that in a way that's a positive response, or whether you're interested by it, you're curious, you love it, it makes you feel certain emotions that perhaps you weren't finding in other kinds of music that you were listening to. It's all great. It's all to the good. But I think that, I was going to say that education maybe is the key to it. It's not so much education, because that also then presupposes that classical music is the better kind of music and therefore should be taught in schools. I'm not really saying that. I think that certainly the curriculum in the UK, I don't know how it is in Korea, but the curriculum has changed over the last sort of 40 or 50 years, where there's all sorts of music from all over the world and all sorts of cultures that are taught, and children are exposed to that. And rock music and electronic music is also part of that. So I think it's like everything, it's part of an ongoing evolution of how we perceive music. And I think if people are putting up structures or impediments in the way to an audience coming to it, like the bow tie. Yes, if you're going to come to the opera, you have to wear a bow tie and a dinner jacket. That's nonsense, because again, I can only sort of particularly speak for the UK, but lots of opera companies and opera houses are encouraging people to come in. It doesn't matter what you wear. The tickets are cheap, way cheaper than going to see like U2 or, I think that it's still now possible to come and see great art, because it is. Whatever you kind of think of the history of it, when you hear some of that music, if your mind is open to it, if your ears are open to it, it's unbelievable music. That's not to say it's better music than something else. Of course it isn't, but it is an extraordinary thing. And I think that the job that I have, that younger classical composers have as part of their output, is to be open and to talk and say, no, come in. It's fine. We don't care what you're wearing. We don't care what you are. Please come in and experience this music, and don't be put off by people in dinner jackets. That's just how they are. That's how they are.
One interesting profile for me was when I was reading your profile, one interesting thing was that your main instrument was the viola.
Yeah.
I read a lot of biographies of musicians and things like that. Not a lot, but fair amount. But I've never read of a musician, like a classical musician who's famous up to today, whose main instrument was viola. Am I wrong? Is there somebody that I'm missing?
In terms of violists who also compose.
Right, and that everybody knows about. Because most composers that we
Mozart.
know are pianists, right?
Mozart played the viola.
Oh, wow. Okay, but he played every other instrument as well.
Of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, there are, I can't think off the top of my head of other composers who played the viola. I'm sure your listeners will send you all the composers. But the thing about the viola that's really interesting from my perspective is that I always see the viola as like the filling in the sandwich, the jam or the mayonnaise or the cheese in the sandwich. That's the stuff that really gives the sandwich its flavor. Yeah, you know what a sandwich looks like on the outside, and there's the melody and there's the bass. But somehow the thing coming from a place of always being on the inside, generally being on the inside of a string quartet or in an orchestra or whatever. As I was growing up listening to music and my kind of production head would be on, I would be listening to the reverb on the snare sound, or what the strings are doing, or the backing vocals, or the other stuff that really flavors the music. And, because we're all generally, particularly with vocal pop music, we're listening and we're singing along. And we kind of know there's the beat and there's a bass line and stuff that's driving it, and the chordal progression, but it doesn't sort of tend to be seen as the most important thing, because people want to sing. Of course they do. It's a communal thing. It's brilliant. But I've always been interested in the detail and what's behind the scenes, looking at the interesting guitarist who's not really communicating with the audience, but doing amazing stuff. So that, I think, also has informed my style of composition, and also the work that I do when I'm doing orchestral arrangements for pop artists.
Mm-hmm. The reason I asked this question was that when I was living in New York, I had a friend who was a viola player. And she said that violists in an orchestra often feel like unloved stepsister of the violinist. Because violinist, the first violin gets to stand up, take a bow for the entire orchestra. Everybody knows who the first violin is. Everybody even knows who the second violin is. If they're familiar with the orchestra, nobody knows who the violists are. The violinists usually get these really technical phrasing that where they can show off their skills, where violists are just going boom, boom, boom. So, so she said that being a violist is really tough, because cellists have their volume, violinists have their fancy skills, but violist, she would say, we violist, we just do bum, 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 and everybody ignores us, right?
It inhabits a more mysterious world, I think.
Wow.
It's not something which is going, ta-da! Here I am. I'm over here. Look at me. I'm great. Look, like you're saying,
That's the violin.
Also, yeah. And also, it's not like, check out the bass line, feel the weight. I mean, and cellists also, because it's an extraordinary instrument. But of course, as I was saying, that the viola is something that it's the window. Yeah, maybe the picture is outside. You open your curtains and there's some trees and sunshine. But actually, the viola in some ways is the filter on the lens. It's the window onto the sound world that the composer is trying to create. I think you take away the violas and you lose richness. I mean, yeah, you could orchestrate it in a different way, have the cello playing higher and all the rest of that, but that creates a different kind of emotion. When cellos play high, it becomes ultra emotional, ultra intense. The viola has a darker sound. It has its own kind of very unique soul, I think, that's yearning, elegiac. I mean, it can be aggressive, it can be angry and all those kind of things, but it's such a voice. It's always really spoken to me. I mean, a lot of violists start on the violin and then go to the viola for any number of reasons. But I've always been a violist right from the first time I got the instrument out of its box. There is just something elusive, just has a very particular soul to it. I'm finding it very hard to describe. I've sat in orchestras, I've sat in many recording sessions for films and stuff, and sometimes there isn't that much to do, and you are adding just a colour. But when I'm writing, when I'm composing, I actually almost start with the viola. I mean, there it is. I haven't actually got it out today yet, but it's always there. It's always there. It informs. It's where I start with everything, even before I switch on a synth or start programming some drums or that's me. That's my musical expression. That is John Metcalfe in instrument form.
Wow. And I put out a little post to my audience saying that I'm going to have an interview with John Metcalfe, and are there any questions you'd like to ask? A lot of Korean audience said, how do you bridge the gap between what they call pure art and commercial art? I know it contradicts what you just said, but what would you say to a Korean person who come to you and say, how do you bridge the gap between pure art and pure classical music and what they might perceive as like a commercial crossover?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we are drawn to stuff that is a kind of like a mirror, or helps to on our own lives, or helps to articulate what we're thinking or what we haven't quite figured out yet. I've got a problem with this. Wow, Bob Dylan said this, or Paul Simon said that, or Beyonce said this. Yeah, that resonates with me. So I think that also informs where the main body of a lot of our culture and art lies. But it ties into the commercial viability of this. And music is sold to sell things as well. So there are lots of, when you say commercial music, there are lots of aspects to that. I think in terms of combining the two, I think, if at all possible, because composers have to live as well. So sometimes there are, composers like Mozart had to write, he was commissioned. Bach was commissioned, but they were all commissioned by Prince Esterhazy or whoever it was. We're all of us have to make a living. But I think that when it comes to writing music for yourself, a purer music, if you like, the one that doesn't have a financial aspect to it, you still want your message to come across. So this thing of how do I express what I want to express, but also for it to resonate with an audience? And that shifting window of like, well, they'll just have to come to me because this is how I feel. I can only write in this way. If they like it, great. If they don't, okay, that's up to them. But if you're also wanting to reach a bigger audience, are you then getting into an area where you're kind of thinking, well, looking at my numbers on Facebook or on Instagram, the kind of people that are following me are these demographics, because this is what my feedback shows me. So I'm going to write something that's slightly easier to understand, or I'm going to write something that's more harmonious or sadder or a little bit more elegiac and gentler, softer, so it doesn't offend people. But you also think, well, if I'm going to do that, which I don't do because I tend not to, but you think, how can I do it with integrity, with where my soul is still intact, with intelligence also, that you're not dumbing your music down. So you're writing something that is credible as a piece of music in terms of composition, but also has reach in terms of its emotional impact and allows people to have those feelings. You know, there are lots of people who are commercially successful, but are absolutely true to their own voice. I'm kind of, you know, I mean, well-known bands. I'm thinking of like Radiohead, for example, an incredible band that absolutely don't compromise their artistic principles, but are a globally successful band.
How did you end up working with Denis? Because I know that he came to Korea maybe a decade ago, and he's been active on the classical music scene here. He was, you know, playing a lot of, you know, he's a guitarist, so he was playing a lot of classical guitar music, introducing Korean people to some pieces that Korean people were not familiar with, like Paco de la Arabia or Albanese, these people that Korean people didn't know. And Denis brought a lot of attention to those composers. And I know he started composing a few years ago, but how did you connect with Korean Belgian guitarist working in Seoul? You're in London working with some of the most famous people in the world, and Denis was maybe locally famous in this sort of small number of people who appreciate classical guitar, but it's a pretty niche place in Korea. It's very difficult to imagine how this world and that world intersected. So how did that intersection happen?
I mean, it's a brilliant example of the wonders of modern communications technology. I knew of Denis because I've worked with other guitarists. I've done sort of arrangements and written stuff for other guitarists. So I have been in that solo guitar world, and I knew of his beautiful playing. But I'd never met him, and so he sent me an email. And one thing is that I love it when I get sort of emails from people that I don't know, because I want to, I'm really enjoying talking to you. I'm, meeting you. I like going out the door in the morning and meeting new people and having new experiences. I mean, I think it's just, it's fantastic. So I said, yes, of course, let's have a chat. And we had, and I think he's a wonderful human being, and he's very open. He's very intelligent. He's a lovely human being. And the fact that he's a wonderful guitarist and an amazing musician as well, it's like, what's not to like? Of course, I'd like to work with you and write something for you. And then, when he also mentioned Anna and said, because I thought I was going to be writing an instrumental piece, and then he mentioned Anna, and I thought, wow, okay, so this is going to be a song as well. That was super cool. And I'd never met Anna either. So we had a Zoom, and she's amazing. She's a real force. Yeah, I mean, that's how it came about. We didn't meet at a cocktail party.
So how did the album turn out, in your opinion?
I think it's beautiful. I think it has great subtlety in it. It has great emotion in it. Yeah, I think the pairing of Denis and Anna is those on the outside of it, those are perhaps two people that you wouldn't immediately put together, but it works. Yeah, I think it's a great album. I love it.
I think one of the reasons that I used to listen to classical music a lot, but now I listen to it much less, is because the world has gotten a lot louder.
Right.
So, I live in a big city. I live in an apartment. There's constant noise around me all the time. I mean, I mean louder in terms of being distracted all the time, but also like physically louder. There's like airplanes going across. There's, electronic equipment beeping everywhere, and, whirling. There's always some kind of fan whirling somewhere. And then one time I traveled to a island with my wife, and we checked into a hotel. There was no roads, nothing around the hotel. It was absolutely quiet. And I put on some classical music, and I'm just like, wow, I remember why I used to like this in my childhood, because I grew up in the countryside, right? And there's nothing we can do as an individual to change the world itself. So how do we work around it as somebody who's trying to create something?
And I think that's why there's a lot of focus for some people on things like mindfulness and meditation and those kind of techniques, where I totally agree with you. I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time. People get stressed by noise. Mm-hmm. It isn't just the volume, but I think the way that also with music and the way that production has gone is everything is really super compressed and super excited, and everybody needs to be louder than the next person in order to be heard, to be noticed. And I think it really stresses. It's one of the things that, I mean, of course, there's a lot of appalling, terrible things that are going on always going on in the world, and it feels like particularly right now. So I think when we are in our own homes and we shut the front door, the fact that, and the TV goes on and there's adverts every 30 seconds or whatever it is, I think it's very hard to wind down and use music in a way to actually try and focus and try and be in the moment, absolutely in the moment, and not distracted. I mean, you're describing me. Of course, I get distracted. I try and turn this off when I'm working. But sometimes, because our way of communication now is immediate, the expectation is that we reply to messages and emails and whatever. That's what people think should happen. And you see people walking around with it, it's a beautiful day and there are some beautiful trees or nature to look at, and people are just having to do this, because maybe that's also how they've grown up with it. So I think to ask people, therefore, to listen to a piece of music that lasts for even 15 minutes or 20 minutes, that has an arc and a journey that only makes sense as you go through it, as you experience it from beginning to end, is a really big ask. And I think in some ways, perhaps that's why people enjoy and want to go to live experiences, whether it's the cinema, whether it's, a classical concert or opera or a gig or a night out dancing, where you can really focus on the music and dance and lose yourself in that. I think that's really important. I mean, I know people get their phones out at gigs as well. Of course they do. And then they're sort of sending that stuff up. But in principle, and certainly it's one thing that Chris Martin and Coldplay has sort of said, and I'm not sure if other bands do it, say, look, just for this song, let's put our phones away. Let's be a group of people experiencing something together, ourselves, communally, in this moment, without thinking about the outside world and capturing it and doing whatever that we do with it to get likes and stuff like that. That's really crucial. And I think that things like forest bathing, being in nature, and not having just having natural sounds, because obviously, when you go to the countryside, and that's something that I absolutely love as well, I get absolutely excited and focused and can listen to the waves on the beach. If I'm swimming and I'm lying on the beach, I will quite often just lie there, close my eyes and just listen to the waves. Or if you're in the forest, you're hearing bird song, you're hearing the reverb in woodlands, you're hearing the wind on the leaves. It's a beautiful music of its own. And I find it very calming, but also I find it I'm focused. I'm really listening to that and nothing else. So there are ways that we can do it. And I think it's really important in order for our brains just to, apart from, when we're awake, to have periods of time like that where we are not like, what's that? Oh my goodness. I think we see something like, is it 3,000 adverts a day? If you're in a city and you're going about your business, you get 3,000 hits that you're seeing from adverts selling you stuff and telling you information, telephone numbers, do this now, and also selling a lifestyle that is not yours. And it's saying, these people over here are having a better time than you. They're richer, they're better looking, they've got more stuff, they go on better holidays, they eat out, they go to all the right parties. And that also, because that's the nature of advertising, to say you need this stuff, even though we don't need most of it. And and it's accompanied by music as well, and the research has been done. So we're just like, it's absolutely crazy. So I think that live gigs, those experiences where audiences go to concerts and can turn their phones off, I've done gigs with, and I know that I'm not the only one to do this, but I think of reducing certain sensory perceptions, like doing concerts in the dark. You're not looking at the performer to say, wow, look at what they're wearing, aren't they great? Or how have they got their hair? Or the guitarist is doing this, or the violinist is that. You are aware, you are in a room with 200,000 other human beings, and it's a collective experience. So it's not about the performer and the audience, and we've paid and we're coming and seeing this thing. It's something that you hope that you can collectively experience. And of course, in that situation, the mobile phone with its light source is entirely inappropriate as well.
Thank you very much for giving me your time.
It's been an amazing hour. I mean, there were such brilliant questions. It was fantastic to have a conversation.
I'm glad you enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed.